but
You could just send the link to, you could describe it and send the link to everybody, or we could send the link to everybody.
yeah. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, we are live. Hello, Joan.
Hi, everybody. How's everybody tonight?
Good seeing you.
Same here, Jeremy. How the kids?
Fed and sleepy. One of them's pushing up against my back because she's not comfortable enough.
All right, I guess, yeah, I can't get the video to work. I will be right back. I'm gonna grab some water.
Okay, and I'm about 2 minutes away from starting the webinar.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to start the webinar now, so hopefully we'll see some attendees start to populate. All right, we have attendees. Good evening, folks, and welcome. We will be starting in a few minutes. Hopefully a few more people will be able to join us. And Katie, when you are ready to start, I'm calling roll tonight.
Okay, that's great. Just looking, we should have a couple.
Yeah, it's just 6 now, so.
Great. Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining so promptly. Good to see you, Richard. Thanks for being here. Okay, great. Awesome. Okay, I see a couple of the speakers coming in. We would just need to promote, yeah, so Jenny's promoted, and then Summer Sandoval. Hi, Jenny. Thanks for joining. Let's see. Okay. Right. Okay, great. So Jeremy, with your help, I would love to do roll call.
No problem. So I'm going to mute everybody. I can find those controls. Okay, so committee members, when I call your name, please unmute yourself. Acknowledge I've called your name, and then, excuse me, mute yourself again. Katie Walsh.
Present.
Thank you. Nick Azadian.
Present.
Thank you. Stacy Boyd. Stacy Boyd. Gladys Bruno. Gladys Bruno. John Fontillis.
I'm here.
Thank you. Cynthia Gonzalez.
Here.
Thank you. Christina Lem. Christina Lem. Sam Sierra. Sam Sierra. Zachary Jacey. Zachary Jacey. If you are a board member but not a committee member, I am not calling your name, but I will write down that you are here. So we have you marked present. I'm sorry, Joan. I believe you are, am I correct? Were you appointed to this committee, Joan? Nope, it was a different committee. My mistake. And we didn't make a mistake on this. So Katie, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yes, and if there are any community board members that are here that would love to be on this committee, we will be happy to have you. So just let Jeremy know. We can add you. So I'd like to get started. There's just a change from the agenda that I wanted to just update. And so let me see. Am I sharing my screen? Yes. Okay, you can see that. Great. All right. So I want to thank everybody for being here. We've got a good number of folks who are still joining online. Just as a reminder for those who have not joined us before, this is the special subcommittee on last mile trucking facilities. We are now going into our fourth meeting of this committee that started in the spring. We first met in May. We heard from Community Board 7 members, organizations, and some of our elected officials. We met again as Community Board 7 with Community Board 6 with Red Hook, again identifying and talking about last mile trucking facilities and impacts and anticipation concerns. And that was shared across both the CB7 and CB6 community. There were over 100 folks in attendance from that meeting. And then May, then July, and then the third meeting that we had was October 25th. And so it's just about a month ago, where we then heard some solutions, or making progress. We'll put it that way, making some progress in understanding this issue from the State Assembly's office, from Marcel Matanius, and Jenny will provide an update today. And again, some additional considerations both from UPROSE and from Earth Justice as well. So we are here at the end of November, November 30th. This is just the Community Board 7 who's meeting tonight, but recognizing that this is really a borough-wide, city-wide issue that we're looking at here in New York. But what I am hoping that we get out of tonight's meeting, and we're kind of steering the ship and setting ourselves up for success. For those that are the committee members, you would have just received a draft of a letter. I will get back to that at the end of the meeting, but what we're starting to do is in this meeting, we'll get some updates from both Marcel's office and as well as from UPROSE. And then we're again leaning into looking at some of the actions and solutions and recommendations that we can identify. And in pursuit of that, asked both a Representative Matt Peterson. I'll talk a little bit more about him shortly, but an example from Los Angeles area of how they're sort of looking at delivery and last mile and logistics hubs and solutions that they're taking. And then here in our own city, we're going to hear from Ryan Lynch's office, specifically Richard Berrick, who's the Director of Land Use for the Borough President's Office, about logistics, last mile, and trucking facilities here in New York. So then we'd go into public comment, and then we will wrap up with looking at this specific committee letter with the intention that the committee letter can go, in fact, to our December board meeting, which is in just a couple of weeks. And we'll talk a little bit more about the timing for that, but that we can actually get it out then for early January for the new year. So I am going to ask, we've got 2 quick updates before I turn to the first presenter. So Jenny, I will turn over to you from the Assembly Member's Office.
Thanks so much, Katie. Hi, everyone. It's good to be back here with you all. I just have a quick update on what we've been working on. So since our last subcommittee meeting, which was at the end of, I believe it was October, we've been kind of pushing forward on exploring potential policy solutions at the state level. At the last meeting, for those of you who weren't able to attend, we kind of presented the results of our research, which was that the state does not necessarily have a very effective angle or hook into regulation that would be able to get a handle on the proliferation of these facilities. The state does not regulate land use. The state does not regulate air quality, or regulates air quality in a way that just focuses on emissions from stationary facilities. But from that research, the most promising kind of avenue for state intervention was something called the indirect source rule. So this is something that is left out of the jurisdiction of the Federal Clean Air Act, and it's explicit that states have the authority to regulate what's called indirect sources of emissions. So sources of emissions that are not coming from stationary facilities themselves, but from indirect sources such as trucking, and that could be a really effective avenue in. So that's kind of the path that we've been looking into so far. We know that there are a number of problems with what's gone on with last mile trucking in Red Hook and Sunset Park, specifically that there is no public review process, that there has been no transparency on the part of the developers in terms of disclosing the projected traffic volume, the projected truck routes, the projected emissions impact. And we also know that, in light of the climate crisis, these emissions are going to have a bigger impact on, our emissions targets as a state as a whole. So those are kind of the 3 things that we were hoping to address in this legislation. We've started to we've started the process of actually drafting and developing a policy framework that hopes to touch upon all of these 3 issues through one piece of legislation. So it's a pretty exciting time. I'm going to leave my email there's no chat, so I'll leave it in the Q&A. If anyone has thoughts, if anyone, wants to get particularly involved in this point of the process, we have about exactly a month before legislative session starts in January. We're really hoping to start off strong with a big push. So this is what's currently coming together. I also wanted to highlight that our office is actually doing what we're hoping to be weekly canvasses in the Red Hook houses. So every Sunday, I think from 12 to 2, we will be out there with a team of volunteers going to, people who live in Red Hook houses and asking them how they feel about this issue, whether they've heard about it, if they have any particular thoughts. Community outreach and input is such a big part of this whole process, and we want to make sure that we're hearing from people that we don't typically hear from. So if you're interested in that part of it too, you're a canvassing, you like to be out in the field, you like to knock doors, you like to have conversations with people, meet them where they're at, please do also email me, because we are doing both of those things. And I hope that is enough for Katie. Let me know if there's anything else, but I will leave my email in the Q&A, and please feel free to reach out.
Jenny, just a follow up. So you're targeting the Red Hook houses. Are you also looking at hitting the parts of Sunset Park that would be directly close by to the proposed facility here in Sunset?
Yeah, so there's no plans to do that right now, but we're always trying to grow our organizing efforts. So if people, wanted to start that, our office can provide the infrastructure and support for that. The thinking is to start in Red Hook right now because that's where there's this closest concentration of these facilities, and it's where we haven't been hearing from public housing residents in terms of how they feel about this situation. So yeah, definitely open. The world is our oyster, I guess is the saying. But yeah, we're growing these efforts. We're trying to push as much as possible. We know that any legislative effort will have to come with a big community organizing effort as well.
Okay, thanks. I just want to ask if any of the community board members wanted to ask any questions to that follow-up. I don't see any hands or anything. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Jenny. Appreciate it. We can follow up. And then I'd love to turn to Summer Sandoval from Uprose. Sharon had presented the last time, but Summer, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. It's good to be back on. Sorry I missed last meeting, but I'm glad that Sharon was able to join and share her comments. I just have a short few updates. Wanting to share three main things. We've been moving a lot in terms of case studies, trying to see what's been done across different municipalities across the country, very much focused on a citywide strategy and how to figure out how to start regulating these facilities ASAP. As we all know, this is not just a South Brooklyn or New York City issue, and that we're seeing just pretty much across the country, specifically in industrial, commercial, mixed industrial areas, that these, giant facilities are being are rapidly growing. And so the two case studies that, and I can, I guess, afterwards share the links to the information, the case studies for you to distribute, Katie. But the two case studies wanting to highlight, maybe some of you are already familiar with, but one is, on the municipal level with the city of Morgan Hill, California. It's a city in California, and this case study was published in the Zoning Practice Journal from the APA in January 2020. So both of these case studies are pretty recent. And so first with the city level case study, this city attempted to start regulating these giant last mile trucking facilities, and specifically in their zoning code to try to mitigate the impacts. They recognized that was really hurting small businesses in the local economy. So they went through and they actually defined from distribution, sorting centers, and they defined all of these terms in their zoning code. But the really actually probably serendipitous and cool thing that might not happen on New York City level, but happened in this city. So they went through and they defined all of these in their zoning code to help start regulating and limiting based off of size. So the base of the size of the actual facility, and then based on the size of the actual type and size of trucks. And so that was their main approach of how to start regulating, was the size of the trucks, the types of trucks, and the size of the actual facilities. And then ultimately, for the city of Morgan Hill, they actually just fully restricted the development of these facilities in the city. And then also the journal quoting that and recognition that zoning codes across the country, were written decades before these types of facilities were a thing, and that thus pretty much all zoning codes are inadequate in really protecting and addressing this issue. The second case study, and want to kind of give high-level overview, is the Massachusetts case study. So this is a statewide report that was published in February of 21, so earlier this year. And the statewide report is called Hidden in Plain Sight: Impacts of E-Commerce in Massachusetts. It was prepared by the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And this is a regional planning agency for the 100 cities and towns around Boston, and their mission is to promote smart growth and regional collaboration. They looked at all of the comprehensive impacts and implications of the whole like e-commerce and trucking supply chain. So from the distribution to the manufacturing and all of the pieces of supply chain. I do have the link handy here for the actual report. Let me see if I can put it. I can add it into the Q&A also when I'm done. But a medium long but very thorough report looking at all of the different impacts, and the report was meant to help inform both local and state decision makers on how to create kind of like a baseline and comprehensive information base to start being able to address kind of collaboratively address regulation for these facilities, which is really interesting. And then lastly, a semi case study, but pulling information from what has been done, and this information is actually directly from the industry of language, and that's really going to be super important when trying to put pen to paper in terms of not just how, but logistically, what are we regulating, what are we limiting, and in what degree and with what strategy. And so this, like I said, this language is directly from the industry, and it specifically looks at the difference between traditional warehouse and fulfillment center, and some of the main points for what makes these two different. Because right now, I think as we all collectively know from earlier meetings, that these facilities are not being regulated by the Department of City Planning because they're being treated as regular warehouses, when we all know that the impacts are significantly different and significantly more adverse to traditional warehouses. And so some of the main points of what differentiates these two, which is important for language, is the amount of time that the goods are sitting at the facility, and that fulfillment centers are seeing these rapid turnaround that move goods directly from the facility to consumers, versus traditional warehouses that are usually utilized by businesses who can't keep all of their inventory or stock on site. And so I think and we can circulate these comments as well, but this is really important in thinking of how to specifically differentiate between traditional warehouses and these last mile trucking facilities / fulfillment centers. We're using a lot of different names to what we're referring these facilities as. And so this is all kind of like moving and growing bodies of research in terms of how do we not reinvent the wheel here in New York City. Obviously, some of the work that's been done in other parts of the country, states and cities, cannot be directly replicated, but how we can draw on those to start to build our own framework for how to address these facilities. I believe that's pretty much it. And like I said, I'm happy to share the links to the case studies and comments. Thanks, Katie.
No, that's great. And Summer, we'll definitely share those. Is there any additional call to action or anything that you wanted to leave folks with? We'll disseminate the resources. Anything additional?
I know that the last meeting Sharon had shared that we're working on a letter. I think that the letter is kind of in the works still. We're tweaking in terms of audience of where we're thinking to target, and we'll be able to share updates. I mean, it's really difficult with holidays, but we're hoping to see updates the next week or two. But this letter is meant to be an open letter that really, really encompasses and it moves in concert with all of our collective research work and citywide strategy of what is the call for, and the different buckets of what we're calling for, from on-site to activities to the actual permitting and development of these facilities. So more updates in terms of the timeline of the letter to come.
That's great. And I really appreciate the citywide approach that you all are taking in this. Well, that's great. And Summer, I think that actually is a really good feeder from talking about case studies and some examples. I was just checking Morgan Hill, California is sort of Northern California. So we're going to go down to Southern California to Santa Monica. And we have Matt Peterson. I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint. I just want to make sure that he is here with us as a speaker. His hand is up, so he's just looking to be promoted. But I will just introduce Matt Peterson. Is the head of Lacey. He'll tell us a little bit more about it. The Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. Matt was actually the CEO of Global Green USA, if you know that organization, led it for about 19 years, co-founded it. And then he was the chief sustainability officer for the city of Los Angeles for many years. He was one of the co-founders, creators of Climate Mayors, which is an affiliation of mayors across the United States that are working on climate action. And in his work overseeing Lacey, he's going to talk a little bit more today about some of the focus on delivery zones and the first of its kind zero emissions delivery zone. So again, this is meant to provoke us and to think about some different ways of solutions to both sides of the coin of the challenge that we're dealing with in our district. So I can see Matt. And Matt, if you're able to unmute yourself, or there you are, great. All right, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure. Do you want me to go through these few slides?
Yes, I think that would be super helpful.
Okay, looks like it's been disabled.
Let's see if I can get Jeremy's help in giving you the.
You should be able to share your screen now.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, good to be with you. It's great to be with Katie again, who we worked together when I was at the mayor's office, and I think we crossed paths even before that. All right. So quick context. LA is like everywhere, seeing an explosion of e-commerce and home and business delivery. Certainly the pandemic only made it worse. And here we have both from the heavy duty trucks, where 40% of all the goods come into the US through the ports of LA and Long Beach onto heavy duty trucks, as well as trains to come across the US. Obviously, some of the goods coming into the East Coast come more up ports more adjacent, but it's a huge source of air pollution. It's in aggregate the greatest source of air pollution. Then you begin to add the diesel trucks for medium duty delivery, and then you've got a huge source of air and climate pollution. So quick context of why, what goals we set and why. And so we created a regional transportation electrification partnership, a public-private partnership. They really complement environmental NGO and environmental justice efforts to get more to reduce tailpipe emissions and move to zero emissions, and also put forth the voice of the business and public sector. So we decided to set some ambitious targets by 2028, when the world will arrive to LA for the Olympics. High level, we won't go through all of our targets, but we set these targets to get 30% of all the cars on the road to be electric by 2028, get 20% mode shift, and then I won't try to read all these, but if you'll notice in the middle here, medium duty delivery trucks, we wanted 60% of all medium duty delivery trucks to be electric. And then of our heavy duty short haul and drayage trucks, the trucks that pick up the containers, 40% of them to be zero emissions. So with these goals as context, along with our principles, including enhancing equity through improved air quality, good jobs, and access to mobility, we put out a call for proposals to submit to in response to an RFI we did. We didn't have a ton of submissions, but we did have some robust submissions. So like we said, who wants to host a zero emissions delivery zone? And we got 3 proposals, 2 from business improvement districts and 1 from the city of Santa Monica. Now, The year before, we'd done an RFI to invite pilots for disadvantaged communities, and we had about 25 submissions, and a little different context, but that was more about delivering solutions. This is more complex. We wanted somebody who could really partner with us to deliver a set of solutions to reduce emissions and prioritize the curb for zero emissions vehicles. So selected Santa Monica. It's a 1 square mile area. If you've ever been out here, you know the Santa Monica Promenade, 3rd Street Promenade, and maybe the Main Street Business District. So we launched the zone, recruited some delivery partners that some better known than others. Alsco Uniforms, not very well known, but certainly on the road here quite a bit. IKEA committed to getting their first 100 electric trucks in the US to be in LA. So they wanted to use this as a chance to figure out any kinks in doing that in the Los Angeles region. So what's this do? It provides a blueprint for cities to adopt zero emissions delivery, learnings for delivery companies, reduces air pollution, noise, congestion, GHG emissions. And then we think it's an economic opportunity. So where do we go from there? We then did an RFI again, this time to see who wanted to provide the solutions. So we got these to submit. Some of them were corporate, some of them were emerging startups. And all were about how do we reduce the emissions. So one of the things that we did, if you can see here on the right hand of the screen, that we used different, it wasn't just about zero emission light duty and medium duty trucks and vehicles. It was about micromobility as well. So how could we get delivery to happen on a scooter or an e-bike? And then how do we manage the curb and prioritize the curb, like I said. There have been things known as the sidewalk delivery robots. I mean, Santa Monica, if you haven't heard, has probably been ground zero for most, not all, but most mobility innovations. Things have changed a bit as Santa Monica's gotten ahead of the parade and restricted a lot of the use to be require piloting and the like. But certainly a few years ago, everything dropped here first. And so we have the delivery robots, which I'm not, I think they may have a path forward, but I think we can walk the food faster than you can in a delivery robot. So where did we go from there? Well, we said we wanted to scale this, so we wanted to extend the pilot. We submitted a proposal to the U.S. Department of Energy. We won the grant with joined with Carnegie Mellon. One of the things just to notice is Automotus is a startup that's joined our startup portfolio, and they were able to provide optical verification technology to determine if the vehicle at the curb is actually a zero emissions vehicle. And while you can't see it on this map, there are 18 curbs, I believe, that are painted and dedicated to zero emission only vehicles in the city of Santa Monica. Now, the city of LA has learned a lot from what we're doing in Santa Monica, and we're helping them in downtown Los Angeles. What they're starting with is 5 curbs dedicated to zero emission vehicles only across the city, with 3 of them in downtown LA. Now, the difference in this case is that Santa Monica is taking a voluntary approach right now, where they're giving warnings for vehicles from traffic enforcement from vehicles that aren't zero emissions. City of LA is writing a ticket. You actually get a $270 fine if you're not. One little going back here, EV truck share. It's the first that we know of in the country. So there are a lot of smaller businesses in Santa Monica that don't necessarily have access to a truck, let alone an electric truck for delivery. So we've gotten from our partners, Roush Clean Tech and Nissan and Lightning, we've put in, I believe, 3 now electric medium duty vehicles and trucks for that are able for the community to be able, for the small businesses in Santa Monica to access them at a reasonable rate. And the city of Santa Monica has provided 5 dedicated charging stations and parking spaces in a city garage. as part of the pilot. So back to the grant. So again, talked about this earlier, but really, how do we learn how to zero emissions direction? What are the policies? What are the enabling policies we need? What are the technological innovations we need to be able to get there? So let's see. In the second year, we're focusing on understanding and integrating the curb data, recruiting more delivery partners, implementing a delivery hub, in addition to the truck share, and driving more usage amongst local businesses with that truck share. And then I talked about expanding to downtown Los Angeles, and of course Pittsburgh, which has been also an innovator in mobility. Just why I added this slide. One of our startups that we incubate, a little later stage company, is Irby. They're on the streets of New York, and I know that they've been expanding their operations. So really quick run through of these slides. I want to just turn it back to you, Katie, and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know that we'll have a couple questions from community board members. And again, this is to provoke some thinking around, we're learning a little bit about these delivery zones, but thinking of lessons that we can take from this as we think about what actions Community Board 7 and others can recommend. Okay, so if you're a community board member, if you can put your hand up, I see Nick, and then we'll go to Cynthia after that. Nick?
Matt, thank you for sharing. This was very informative. My question is, in terms of California, there was some kind of zoning resolution or something that basically mandated that zone?
No, we did it all by city initiative. Now, what we would be required on a state legislative enabling state legislation would be if the city decided to charge a equivalent of a toll tariff. That we do not have that enabling legislation. I guess in New York you have some version of that, but we do not. But the city can price the curb. They can, give a ticket or prioritize access to the curb that's under their jurisdiction. So that's been the approach so far.
And how has the enforcement been, and specifically how much enforcement is being done between Santa Monica versus LA?
Well, we're early days on both. The city of LA's first curb space was just painted and unveiled in October. And the city of Santa Monica curb spaces were painted. Everything got delayed because of COVID, and they had a severe budget situation where they cut a number of employees right when COVID hit. Anyway, so those were only put in place, I think, beginning of the summer. So we're really early days in seeing utilization. I mean, anecdotally, in the city of Santa Monica, no surprise, the vehicles that are parking there aren't always zero emissions, but that's the point we're learning and seeing how we can get the traffic enforcement to be more responsive when they do get the notification from our optical verification device that they go out there and issue warning. And it's about education to start.
Just as a question then, when these zones or these areas were chosen, it was essentially all of the parking spaces or loading zones, or was it select ones? I'm sorry, I missed part of the presentation.
No, so what we did is this, they kept some existing traditional loading zones, and the city decided to repurpose 16 of them. Actually, I think some of them were parking spaces they took. I mean, just like New York, Brooklyn, and Manhattan, parking is a premium here. So significant commitment to dedicate that curb space, and then signage saying this is a zero emissions only curb parking space at the curb.
I think the issues in New York will be a little bit different than possibly in LA. I can tell you that, I do not own a car, but I can tell you that parking is, almost a barbarian sport.
Yes.
In order to try to, get it when you need it. And if we were to be taking parking spaces away, I think that would more than likely be problematic. I mean, it's very much up our Department of Transportation's alley, but I won't bore you with our issues with that. But it seems like we would have to give up more in order to facilitate this program. And I think we'd have to think about it a little bit differently. And one other question I have, instead of zero emission distribution zones, Is there any thought about zero emission? I guess the midpoint in the distribution, essentially in the the main trucking areas. And I know that's far off given the technology, but
well, there's two things here. So what's I mean, we don't have the density, obviously, of let's say Manhattan, and I'm sure in Brooklyn, where you've got these many warehouse, or maybe not so many warehouses being propped up across the city. Most of the truck traffic bringing the last 50 miles of the goods are, they're 20, 30 miles probably away, 40, 50 miles away in the Inland Empire. So usually what happens is the trucks at the ports of LA and Long Beach pick up the containers, they're moved to a warehouse. Some of them are near to those ports, some are 40, 50 miles away in what we call the Inland Empire, where there's a whole host of mega warehouses that have been built in the last 10 years and increasingly so, where what happens then is that the air quality district has decided to restrict through an indirect source rule the ability to operate diesel trucks. So that's going to be the forcing function to get the larger Class 8 trucks to be zero emissions. Will it influence the smaller medium duty trucks? That part hasn't been figured out yet. So that's why we're trying to focus on the other end of it, as well as at the front end. The ports of LA and Long Beach are going to require all zero emission trucks by 2035.
So I guess in New York, we're I guess a little bit more backwards. And, I'm going to yield my time in a second here because I've asked a lot of questions, but the main issue that we have is that a lot of the trucks are coming in directly to these larger warehouses, off of the BQE and the major highways that we have, both in our specific district along with Red Hook. And then you have, on top of that, the smaller traffic, medium-sized trucks doing the deliveries, typically to residential sections and also the commercial sections of the city. And so we do not have those state laws that limit the emissions for indirect sources. We do not have a lot of those other things. So really kind of we're playing cards with half a deck, and we're looking at ways of providing solutions that, give, these communities a fighting chance versus, basically having 2 million trucks show up on our doorstep tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do I do want to go to Cynthia in a second, Cynthia, I'm going to go to you, but I couldn't figure out how to play it live, but there's this video about the Inland Empire. So what Matt is talking about these trucks or the distribution centers themselves and then making their way. I'd really encourage everyone to look at it. It's just about 2 or 3 weeks old. It's from the Los Angeles Times and kind of gives you a sense of like what it looks like when, again, Red Hook has got a bunch of these already up in progress, but what it looks like at scale and the impacts and the indirect source rule coming about also kind of looking at the conversations we're having right now that Jenny just presented on to address some of these issues, but they're very much like living and breathing this right now. There is a question. So we'll go to Cynthia
One quick
Gonzalez.
thing, Matt, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate you coming out. It was very informative. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Cynthia?
Yes, I want to also thank Matt because I heard a lot of things here that I had never heard of. And Nick, excuse me, Nick addressed a lot of the questions that I had, especially in regard to, the loading zones, the delivery zones, the curb dedications. Here we have a problem where even, those mid-sized trucks that come to deliver are blocking traffic because there's a lot of reasons for that, because now that we have like outdoor eating places, there's a lot of our parking has been taken away, and there's really very little spaces where these trucks can park. So if they're parking and making a delivery, they're like holding up the whole block. I live on a block where the fire department comes down, because they're right around the corner. So I'm always worried that something bad could happen with regard to that. But my question to you was that in these dedicated vehicle zones, right, are the charging stations going to be placed there? Where are these charging stations going to be put
Yeah, that's a good question.
in your case?
Yeah. So we are adding, so we have Santa Monica, as like I said, has dedicated 5 charging stations for commercial electric commercial delivery. And 3 of
These
those
are all in the industrial zone, Matt?
this is all in a business district. I don't know, like, I'm trying to think, like, I don't know Brooklyn that well, but like more kind of around Metro Tech, and my son goes to NYU, so I'm thinking of,
I
of
see.
sort of that area. It's less industrial. What we're doing is then we're adding work with the city to add in a shared fast charger that can be used by medium duty delivery trucks, because what makes the most sense is for them to charge overnight where they domicile, where they park at night, whatever fleet yard that they have. That's more efficient and cost effective, but they of course are going to need sometimes a charge that, the fast chargers that take a lot more electricity, but charge the vehicle a lot faster. So that's what we're working on as sort of a hub of charging for delivery in Santa Monica to again see how that operates with the different trucks that are. We only have a handful of electric trucks dedicated to Santa Monica so far, but that's going to change as well. And now we're trying to get some of the food delivery companies to use the curb space as a way to encourage their drivers of food delivery to get behind the wheel of an EV. Uber and Lyft are already doing that and are required to get there in California by 2030. So those are some of the things we're doing, but charging overall, and that's a constraint in a place like Manhattan or Brooklyn, where if you've got trucks parking somewhere, adding the space required for charging is going to be difficult, which then leads to, well, how do you play with different form factors or different modes? And that picture I showed you of the e-bike, Amazon is using it already, and I think that they and others are going to be expanding the use of that, not that just that model, but other versions of it, because you just pointed out the reason why, which if they have to double park and they're blocking traffic, they get citations, or anyways, it takes longer to deliver. It takes them longer to put them on a hand cart to then walk them down the block than when they're pre-packing them in the warehouse into these containers that are being biked around. It's just more efficient in a place like certainly Manhattan and most of Brooklyn than it is here in LA. But that's the other, I think, direction that you could encourage through whatever policy or efforts. I think it's happening. So how do you encourage that and make it easier?
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, so much. And one of the things I heard you say in your presentation is just that you had the city as a willing partner. The city was willing to experiment, to innovate, to introduce some of these and be able to work with you. Are there, and you've got the state level, you've got the indirect source rule, which is looking at some of these big trucks, which limits the size. Then you're looking at medium-sized trucks and trying to figure out, are there any other sort of ingredients of what you'd see that you had from the city level?
Well, I think one of the reasons we were able to dedicate, I know sounds like from firsthand knowledge and from what you shared, parking is even more at a premium there. But the reason we were able to get curb space was we did outreach to local businesses and the elected officials. And so by building that support, getting them to see, hey, this is going to reduce the noise, it's going to reduce the pollution, it's going to reduce loss of parking that could be for your customers, for the parking spaces that are dedicated to them. It's going to reduce traffic potentially if they don't have to block anything. And then the idea of using e-bikes and e-scooters made for delivery is another angle. So I think that it's just that neighborhood outreach has been really critical.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for joining us. I know it's your afternoon, so appreciate coming into community board meeting in South Brooklyn.
There are some specific questions for you in the Q&A if you have the opportunity. I understand you're working.
Okay. Yeah, I'll take a minute before I go and answer them.
Thank you so much, Matt. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you. Well, that's wonderful. So I would love to turn back to our agenda. Well, I won't put it up, and I'll actually think I see Richard is on available. Great. Who is the Director of Land Use for Borough President's office. Richard, you came to our last meeting and you were giving some uh, suggestions and input on thinking about what some strategies are to deal with the last mile and these massive trucking facilities for Sunset, for Red Hook. So we invited you back. We would love to hear what the borough, what you're thinking, and the borough president's office. I don't know if you have any slides or if you're just planning on speaking. Okay, well, I will open the mic over to you. You are still muted, so just letting you know.
All right.
Yes,
Should be
great.
good now.
Thank you.
Okay. So our office really has been more of an observer and more engaged within the Red Hook area. We did write a letter to, the borough president wrote a letter to DOT regarding the Red Hook truck route issues, because it's been an unresolved situation for probably more than 25, 30 years already. So we put some suggestions out there, and we've been dabbling with the concept of goods coming in maritime, right? So Red Hook actually has several waterborne sites that either could have direct load from the Blue Highway, or perhaps a site with waterfront access could actually connect by a very short shuttle ride to these just-in-time warehouse sites. You're a different dynamic right now. Obviously, you're affected on three levels. One is the possibility of a site. The second is you are a through route to sites such as Red Hook. And the third is you are a place where local deliveries are going to happen. So you're going to be looking at three levels. So on the level of site, there was the conversation, I don't know if it's gotten as far as building permits of the site around 20th Street becoming one of these facilities. And so living with the site means obviously trucks coming into the neighborhood, and some of the trucks going out will be getting onto the highway system or the truck routes to get out of the neighborhood, or they may be coming into the neighborhood to do that last mile delivery, right? So that's one scenario. Then you have the trucks that are driving to other facilities that are just using your road network. And given that the BQE, the Gowanus, doesn't always handle its traffic up within the interstate, you have the flow that drops down to 3rd Avenue and 4th Avenue, right? So you're dealing with that factor. And then, of course, the final factor is coming into the local streets. So I'm going to be discussing on two levels things to that you don't necessarily have direct say in, but certainly the board could consider a resolution as a call for, and also networking with other communities that you might think are in a similar situation where it's more of a larger joint resolution to deal with. So earlier you heard talk about zoning classifications and these facilities, and right now it's very simple, a use group 16 warehouse. So it's not just industrial areas that warehouses are allowed, they're allowed in C8 districts, although most of the C8 districts are kind of slender, but there are a few thicker ones.
So what are we meeting for? If
Say it
what we're
again?
talking about.
I'm not sure what you're trying to say.
Sorry, I think it was a mistake. You can keep going,
Okay.
Richard. Thank you.
All right. So the question would be, from a starting point with the existing definition, does that remain the definition? That typically would be an application done by the Department of City Planning, and would take some lead time to figure out what makes sense, if this makes sense to proceed with. There are examples that were done recently where some are wrapping up the process, such as hotels, the idea of a special use permit that could affect some warehouses or all warehouses. You have a more recent example that was adopted with the self-service storage facilities where they became more limited to where they were allowed as of right. So a special permit is an action that requires circulating to the community board and borough president and then city planning commission. It's an optional item for the city council. So that would be, the idea would be setting up findings that would have to be met to allow a facility. And then of course, thresholds could be established that certain sizes would require a special permit, could be other sizes would be exempt and continue to be as right. So that I doubt within the Department of City Planning, can't speak for them, given that we're near a new mayoral government, whether how much this has been on their radar in terms of, is this something that should be done? And, you know, it's too soon, right, to see if this is something for another administration to decide if this is something to proceed with. So that's the whole zoning process, but it would require a environmental application. It may or may not require an environmental impact statement, but it would be a somewhat blanket application similar to, for example, the self-storage or the hotels. So that's something you don't control of, but it's something that the board could take a position at least to call on and decide how much they want to coordinate with other community boards that may or may not be impacted. So then in terms of what the board can also take positions on and try to advocate that are simpler, a lot of times when we review land use applications, we go beyond the actual land use application. A lot of times we've looked at corners, for example, and how corners could be made better for pedestrian improvements. You have certain examples of, I'll call them interim improvements, because you're basically paint, where when you had your 4th Avenue corridor done, you had sidewalk widenings done where you had paint of white edges replicating the curb with some plastic posts and surfacing. So both looking at the combination of where trucks may be passing through, where trucks may or may not be coming out of a distribution facility in Sunset Park, such as around 20th Street, which doesn't connect to the grid other than 3rd Avenue, right? It's dead-ended. And then you have the short hauls. So where might it make sense to call for a version of traffic calming where looking at where corners maybe should be expanded out into the street to manage how trucks make right or left turns onto these streets? So that's certainly a strategy. And another strategy is with lighting. The BQE is not naturally bright, right? So with trucks coming out of a just-in-time facility in Sunset Park, or in the context of 3rd Avenue below the BQE taking on vehicles, would lighting help avoid pedestrian conflicts? And could the BQE structure have lighting fixtures attached to it to be something that promotes public safety? And then the question becomes jurisdiction. Are you dealing with the state if you're using the BQE structure, or are you only dealing with city DOT? And in all cases, whether it's lighting and or painting on the roadway surface, so that's expense budget item for the painting. The lighting may or may not tap into capital in terms of getting something like that done. The other thing DOT also looks at when they do these sidewalk improvements at a painted way into the roadway, they may want a maintenance partner to deal with. I don't know what you had done on the 4th Avenue section with the bikeway, but if you're doing it, especially disconnected from bikeways, you may need nearby businesses involved to say that they would maintain it to a standard that DOT would require. And I think the context that you have commercial corridors on 8th, you have smattered commercial corridors on 7th, but you certainly would have vehicles doing last mile turns on these streets. You know, what streets are likely streets to feed to get to the homes that you might think about, where having the corners dealt with in a certain way to protect pedestrians make most sense. Obviously, 5th Avenue commercial corridor. 4th, it's hard to say whether any reevaluation should be done based on the work that's put in place. But 4th Avenue also puts you in position because you have things in place already. Does any of the corridor transition to a permanent improvement where you would need capital put into DOT's budget? So does that come from the mayoral budget? Does it come from borough president, your local council member? And if there are places the board would want to recommend such improvements, again, taking a board position on where you think such improvements are successful, that you now want to take them to the final level and triaging, because not everything can necessarily be done at once. Are there places you'd like to see such improvements initiated first, or in what sequence to achieve perhaps full implementation of permanent improvements? And I'll stop and take, I guess, if there are questions at this point, dialogue on this.
Yeah, there's a couple questions. Thank you, Richard, for coming back and going through this in a very sequenced way. I want to ask first question, which is, you talked about a letter that Eric Adams, as borough president, had issued to DOT on behalf of Red Hook. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what that letter was and when it went out?
I'm not sure the exact date, but I'll say it was perhaps a year ago, give or take. I'd have to look into files. The intent was to basically say it's time to deal with Red Hook truck route now, not really next study. We decided to look at some of the ideas that were put forth in the Red Hook 187A plan, which I actually participated on multiple levels before working for Borough Hall and then after. So we literally put out routes that we thought were worth a conversation to put in truck routes for Red Hook.
Okay, and was there a meeting? Was there follow-up? Was there any action or response from DOT?
I don't recall a response from DOT. I believe that they were looking at studying things. Certainly it's evolved at DOT because the commissioner, so Henry, I guess his domain there is about a year as being DOT commissioner. And this is something, from what I understand, he's had some meetings to familiarize himself with the topic. So under Henry's leadership at DOT, certainly I suspect the level of attention has been paid, so more so by government than not, but I don't know where they might be in terms of truck routes for Red Hook.
Okay.
Separately, EDC has dealt with the maritime highway improvements. So I think that's ongoing, and they've probably keep DOT abreast among some of their thinking in that regard.
Yeah, I was just curious because to learn if you got anything out of DOT, because this community board 7 has made consistent requests and letters to Department of Transportation and gotten lack of transparency, lack of accountability, lack of attention. So that was the curious case to see what Red Hook, if they had a response. Okay, in order of John Fintillis, John DeLooper, and then Nick Azadian. If you can just put your hand up. I did just want to say this is the Special Committee on Last Mile Facilities. We also have a Transportation Committee. I did see some questions that came in that are specific about the 20th Street route, and I'm going to ask Jeremy to remind me when the next Transportation Committee meeting is, because that's a really good place to raise those issues, as well as just calling the district manager, calling Jeremy tomorrow about some of these specific localized street issues. But John, over to you.
There isn't a transportation committee on the agenda. I did tell at least one person to come to this meeting tonight. You can bring up 20th Street.
Okay, no, that's good. I'm glad. Okay, so then we'll make sure we capture it. Okay, thanks. Sorry, John. Go for it.
Hi, Kay. Can you hear me? Just check. Okay. Hey. Hi, Richard. John Fontillis here. A question, because I think, after going through a lot of the discussions that we've had on last mile warehousing, a lot of the feeling I think the committee has is if there was only a way for the community to review these projects as they come up, which, and I'm glad you brought up the M1 Hotel text amendment. It seems like a process that would make sense, because you could make particular recommendations, you go through a particular process for the community that's affected by these things. And because it's a text amendment, you're not trying to rewrite the entire zoning code. You're really trying to provide as it were, a gauntlet of review that any developer would have to go through in order to get these warehouses done. But if I could just ask, I believe that whole process for the M1 Hotel text amendment was kind of started with a bunch of community boards, I believe in 2014, 2015, of which we were one, that were really angry about these hotels going up in our industrial districts. And I believe it took about 3-4 years, if I'm correct, for that finally to go through a ULURP process. Does that sort of jive with your recollection of that process? And do you think that's a similar process that might be reasonable for us to try and pursue in order to get some community review for the last mile warehouses in our district?
I think it's hard to say how long a process would be for multiple reasons. But I think once the city decides it's something they would want to look at, then the question becomes, where do they draw on to get a basis for what might make sense, if anything makes sense? And like, is there a facility that could ever make anyone happy, versus, okay, we're just looking to purposely shun facilities in certain locations, so if you make it over 100,000 square feet or 50,000, why is that the right number? And based on the findings, does it really mean you not having a facility move? What can the findings be that make someone warm and cuddly, right? Because the vehicles are leaving, they're not at the site. So are the impacts site-based, or are they how many blocks or miles away? So that's why it's a hard thing to really say. You have, to really wrap yourself around and saying, are we doing this just because, or do we have a really good reason?
And you're right. I mean, if you say that warehouses that are 100,000 square feet or less have to be reviewed, what prevents the developer making it 100,001 square feet and thereby not having a review, right? So I understand, but the M1 Hotel text amendment, we really had a stake in the matter, and I remember there were several community boards in Queens, around JFK, that were also worried about the proliferation of hotels in their industrial districts. I mean, obviously, we were concerned with the hotels turning into homeless shelters, and lo and behold, that COVID actually did that. Although now they're coming out of it, but it just seemed like a a process that we could point to that was a success. But I hear what you're saying. It's not, the impacts are more diffuse for these warehouses as opposed to the hotel.
And there's two other forms of review at a lesser standard. One is an authorization where it still gets referred to the community board and it just goes to the city planning commission. The borough president plays a role, but it'd be more like getting your ducks in order kind of things. And a lesser version, the board could have a role in drafting of the language. And then on a case-by-case basis, the board would have no role. It's called the certification. You have that in your waterfront areas where city planning certifies, where you have retail markets, city planning certifies are fresh. So it doesn't go to the community board, but drafting the rules that the city planning commission has to work around is an area where community boards can have input.
I see. Okay. I mean, it was very helpful just to think through the land use answers to this. I don't know if there's a silver bullet on the land use side. Unfortunately, it sounds like it's the issue about truck emissions might be more, direct in order to get control of it.
Well, again, when they're at these facilities, and there's a difference, right? When it's refrigerated versus non-refrigerated, how long can a truck show up, get offloaded, and get onto multiple smaller vehicles? And does the truck need to be on when this is happening, or is it able to be cooled because they're plugged in?
That makes sense.
Is the issue emissions? Is it conflict between truck and pedestrians and whatever else?
I just wanted to add to John, to your comments. So we were contacted by the district manager, Jeremy, and I had a call with the district manager from Community Board 5, so that's East New York, so Starrett City and Cypress, and it's the same challenge that they're dealing with, and they're saying there's other communities being impacted in community boards. So in terms of that call to action from community boards, I mean, it's affecting, right? Like, not just on the delivery, but these trucking facilities are really feeling it, and other community boards are reaching out to others. John, and then Nick.
All right. Hey, so I just wanted to follow up with one of the points you mentioned about the infrastructure that could possibly be used to help with these issues. Specifically, you talked about the paint for the like the painted curb extensions with the bollards, like on 4th Avenue. I would say that I love the idea of doing those to help designate what things are and aren't truck routes and helping with things like that. But I would urge, if the borough president's office is looking into these things, to consider more permanent or more durable materials, because those things just, a 53-foot trailer certainly would not be deterred by any of those, and even a box truck, that they're not going to have much effect. The other thing I wanted to ask was about, you mentioned about the lighting under the BQE, and one thing I've noticed in recent weeks' work seems to have restarted on adding lighting and adding LED lighting, which is really helpful. But there's still certain areas that are not adequate for pedestrian or driver safety in the area. And my question for you was, you mentioned something about how capital could be applied to it, but there were also state issues. Could you explain that a little bit more?
So the question is the physical structure of the BQE the jurisdiction of the state of New York as opposed to the city of New York? Because where you're placing improvements, you have to work through the jurisdiction. And so I don't recall, I think it is a state structure, but I'm not 100% positive on that. And then
it is, Richard.
Yeah, so then the question would be, to apply funding there, would lighting be deemed a capital improvement, or would it be an operational expense at the state level? And knowing that answer, for example, to what extent can your state assembly members, state senators get discretionary funds, or can it be rolled into any of the contracts that are still open on the BQE? Because, you know, you still have equipment occasionally blocking Third Avenue. So is there a way to work into those open contracts and be, say, an addendum to the existing contract with the contractors in place? So there may be some avenues to do things faster than starting from scratch. So I think a dialogue with the state context you have regarding the Gowanus improvements would be helpful at that level. Regarding the materials, I think that's a conversation with DOT, whether you do it through the Borough Commissioner, Keith Bray, or if there's other more explicit units that are more involved in the application. I don't know that there's an opportunity beyond a one size fits all in terms of the interim improvements, right? Because the whole idea is that this is kind of a demonstration, and then you saw what happened in many places, including the avenues in Manhattan, where they start becoming concrete curbs. So the idea of which streets might have more interference from a large truck that maybe should be triaged to be done first as a permanent improvement, as opposed to going back with more white paint and bollards and whatever else. I think that's a discussion I had. Then the question would be how to get that paid for. So is this something that DOT has that it could work through with the capital budget with the mayor, or does it need funding directed to its capital budget by a future borough president and or council member allocation?
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, go to Nick and then Karen.
Richard, good to see you again. Very quick question. Let's say you hypothetically wanted to slow these particular warehouses down. How would you go about doing that in a hypothetical situation?
Not so easy, right? I mean, property owners are free to make decisions, and literally if they're building as of right and they're following the plans and they're working the correct hours, then they proceed. You know, if they're working after hours for various reasons, there are ways to work the process through the community board 311 elected offices to say, you know, they're not building correctly. Residents on 16th Street certainly lived that in a time when the neighborhood got its comprehensive rezoning for that section of the board, right? So, you know, to somebody that's a form of harassment, but it's a legal form of harassment if somebody's doing something wrong, right? You know, you draw the line of.
So essentially it would be hypothetically 311 complaints stipulating either working outside of their permits, or if there are items within the construction that were not perceived to be correct and things of that nature.
Like not matching their plans, but you don't want to be harassing.
I wasn't saying I was doing it. I was just saying hypothetically, if someone were.
No one should be. I mean, people unfortunately do that. And it's a waste of government resources when they're going out on calls that have no merit. You know, you wouldn't want to see that happen. And again, most of these facilities are not near anyone, right? So they're more tucked away in business zones where people aren't necessarily impacted by the construction. You know, there may be some cases where, because of the size of facilities, a weekend permit might make sense for a certain construction activity to not impact nearby businesses. But again, because of the dead end nature, where you're more likely, based on the articles, to get a facility, you don't really have that condition. So whether other sites in the industrial zone look that route, then it's a different issue, because now they're potentially impacting more neighbors through their construction.
Gotcha.
Is it okay if I go to Karen, Nick?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Richard.
Okay. And Richard, I just wanted to say, because I just hearing you talk about they're not near people, that's a misconception. I think we need to kind of like nip in the bud. These last mile facilities are near people. People live nearby, and the trucks live nearby. So at the highest level, we need to acknowledge that and be tackling this, because that's what we're dealing with, and that's what our experience is, as well as Red Hook. So just I think that's something that's really important, to be thinking about these facilities and the challenges that our communities are going through with these.
My point, though, was the actual facility itself across the street doesn't tend to be a residential structure. On the same block doesn't tend to be a residential structure. You know, trucks driving a block or two from residential to get to their route, I get that. There's impact for people who live nearby in a different way. But typically the actual physical construction has not been something impacting people on a residential neighbor level.
In Red Hook, they've got the park right across the street. That's where kids are practicing. I mean, they're in it, they're living it, they're in it. So they're not that. Yeah, but I don't want to belabor that point. We're in a solutions mode right now, but I just wanted to make sure I heard that. So I just wanted to make sure I kind of took a chance to capture Karen Rolnick.
Yeah,
Thank
hi.
you.
Can you hear me? Okay. You know, this is a very high pedestrian area, to the point Katie was just making, not just for pedestrians from residences, but there are businesses on the waterfront now where there are a lot of people employed, and they're going back and forth from the subway, using those streets. There's a lot of pedestrians, and you know, markings on the street are great, and plastic ballards or whatnot, but it's not going to be safe. It's not, if people are going to get hurt. And you know, we definitely need like concrete barriers for sure, but even, you know, getting more, I don't know, pie in the sky or whatever, it's a long-term solution. But we just passed this enormous infrastructure bill. Could we get on-ramps to the BQE? You know, there are no on-ramps that can handle trucks. They're, you know, it's very awkward getting on the BQE from the waterfront. And is there a way to tap into some of this infrastructure money and get on-ramps? We've been asking for them for years. Who are we going to call? That's my question.
There's probably not a very simple solution to that. It's been something I've looked at Borough Hall since the mid 90s, right? Because I've been there since 93, end of 93.
It's an ongoing.
And you know, to do on-ramps, do you want to lose neighboring businesses or residents to create the space for it as part of the logistical problem? And so you don't really have an easy solution of where you could place one in the first place to make that happen. So yes, if funds are there, you could have them, but there's a price to be paid. And I'm not sure if the price to have on-ramps by 38th, 39th Street justify what has to be done to make it happen.
Yeah,
that's the challenge.
It would be complicated. There are, you know, buildings and things you'd have to get, you know, eminent domain, which is not something you want to do. But I mean, I really think it's unsafe, and I really think we have to find a way to get the trucks out of this area, because there's too many pedestrians. But I don't know. It just seems plastic ballards and painting marks, you know, aren't going to protect very many people when you're against a big, huge truck. So that's all I have to say. I'm done. I guess I don't have a solution.
Thank you, Karen. Jeremy.
I was going to say, identifying high volume areas where pedestrians cross, whether it's to the businesses from the trains, buses, people going to the park, you know, triaging and trying to figure out which intersections are most vulnerable, and understanding where they are is a starting point. And whether they end up plastic, whether they go straight to concrete improvements, but you have to figure out where they are, where you want to make improvements.
Yeah, one of the major challenges we have is Department of Transportation is not accountable and transparent in terms of any of these concerns or asks that we've made. So, talking about allocation of funds and resources to New York City Department of Transportation, they've been wholly unaccountable. So it makes this issue really challenging. So,
Katie, if I may add,
yeah.
it's sad that it then falls to the community board that does not have expertise in these matters to then make the recommendations as to what treatments and what locations along the corridor would be appropriate for safety measures.
But again, there's a flow to the park. So what streets are the flow to the park, right? From the trains to the businesses, what streets are the flows? So whether it's a conversation you might want to have with SWIBDIC, maybe getting a student project from several of the New York City graduate schools in planning, there may be ways to get there to analyze where you have the flow of people.
And maybe we'll be lucky and the next administration will appoint somebody at DOT who listens to communities, whoever that may be. Richard, there was one person who wrote in Q&A directed to you a statement. And I believe he's left, but if you have the opportunity to read that, I would appreciate that.
Thank you, Richard. And we do have, we're looking at 2022. We've got new leadership at the mayor's office, city council, across the board, local government. And so it's going to be really critical that we have partners in the mayor's office that are going to prioritize this and also prioritize this within Department of Transportation. So thank you for making time with us tonight. And I know you're answering that question right now, but again, just really, really appreciate you making some time with us. We'll capture this in some of the notes and recommendations of next steps for the community committee letter. The next section is for public comment. I have the benefit of Jeremy. He's going to help us with timekeeping. If you are a member of the public and you want to raise your hand, there were two, but I think one had to run. So I just see one hand up right now. But if anyone from the public wants to speak, this is our public comment section. So Jeremy, I see Maria.
Maria, you can unmute yourself now.
Okay, and there I am. All my concerns and questions at this point are much more at the sidewalk level. Not a day passes that when I go out, and this is what I'm looking at, what I'm seeing is being backed up by other people because they're seeing the same thing. The takeover of our sidewalks not by trucks parked half on the sidewalk and half on the street. In there, when you bring it to a driver's attention, well, I'm trying to get out of the way. There is the double parking that then is used as an excuse by the throttle bikes and the delivery people and every other two-wheeler that they can get through, and therefore they have to make money, they have to make a living, no matter who is they put in harm's way. And I have been told more than once that the city council told them that they have access to the sidewalk and I believe that it is true from my research, that they can mount the curb at the corner in order to ride on the sidewalk to reach their place of business or where they're making a pickup. And so I'm seeing elders, I'm seeing young families with strollers, I'm seeing people in wheelchairs being literally attacked, having bikes thrown at them and being yelled at, having the finger. And it's happened to me to the point that I've had to stand in front of a bike and say, get on the sidewalk. There are two children playing here and just and why do I, as a pedestrian and as a citizen, have to take that action? Because now the city council has, on some level, given permission to people to misbehave, and this is something we, as a community, need to take up with the incoming city council. Maybe we can rethink this, these changes in the law, or whatever, that this is not working out on the street. It is pandemonium out here. It is like the wild, wild west, and nobody wants to touch it. The police doesn't want to touch it because they are afraid of being called racist, of being called anti-immigrant, of being called anti-cycling. And so we need to look at this aspect.
Please wrap up.
Conversation. It's not being talked about. It's not being talked about. The trucks, the delivery trucks that are on the street now, the ones we all know, are blocking bike lanes that everybody.
Please wrap up, Maria.
Okay, I'm putting it out there. I've waited patiently. I've brought this issue up again and again and again and again at different conversations. There's no enforcement. Nobody's getting ticket. Nobody's having their vehicle impounded, or some are, but not to the degree. So I would like to ask the people of the board, what is being done from the board's point of view to give these issues some serious attention? Okay.
Thank you, Maria.
Yeah, and I'll just tackle that, and then Jeremy, if you want to say it too. There was a November 10th Public Safety Committee meeting that I attended. Many of the folks who did here too. There were a couple of topics. Maria, you were there as well, on e-bikes, on parking, on illegal parking, on sidewalk parking, and it was also with the 72nd precinct. And the captain raising these issues, the 311 calls, right, and talking a little bit about this. The next day, the captain resigned. 72nd precinct resigned. And so this is something I know that Cynthia Felix, who's the chair of the Public Safety Committees, was planning on writing a letter and following up from a lot of the issues that were raised. And it is, as you said, this is also an enforcement issue within DOT. Jeremy, did you want to add anything else in terms of next steps?
So I wanted to point to that meeting as well. I know at that meeting, you also pointed out that while they say they have been speaking to the bike shops themselves, you were on the spot that night, actually walking down the street, and you stopped in a bike shop who had never heard from the precinct. So that's one of the asks that we have, is that they actually reach out to the places where people are getting bikes to have something that explains the law, that people who are getting for example, dirt bikes, which you're allowed to buy in New York City, but you're not allowed to ride in New York City. That explains it is not legal to ride this in New York. Whether or not that's helpful, I don't know, but the precinct said they've been doing that, and they had not been doing that. There was one other item I was trying to recall, and oh yes, also in our expense budget request this year, we've asked DOT to do comprehensive bike training for folks who bike through our community, or wish to learn the rules of the road and the laws and things they must follow, and safety aspects, what they could do to protect themselves and what they need to have equipment wise, for example. That's what our board has been doing through public safety and through our expense requests.
Right. So it is well taken and moving forward, I think, in a couple of those committees. So thank you, Maria. I don't see any other hands up for public comment. So with that, I'm going to move to the last agenda item, which is to say to the community board committee members that are here. There's a couple of folks who are not on the committee. If you'd like to be, please let Jeremy know. Everybody who's on the committee would have just received a letter, and it should have come through to you right before the meeting. But what I'm going to do is just share my screen and introduce it. Not going to spend too much time on the actual wordsmithing, but I just want to give the idea of what this is. As a for example, so this is a text that you would have gotten if you're on the committee. What we are planning on doing is putting a letter out that we would like to bring this to the December board meeting. So this can be a letter that's issued from Community Board 7. And we'd like to be able to get this out just after the new year in January, when we have mayor and other levels of governance. It's a call, the call to action is to have requests for meetings. So one of the things we need to do is allocate and identify all of the agencies and representatives that we want this to go to. And this could be Community Board 7 alongside, we already know Community Board 6 who hosted this meeting with us. We already know Community Board 5 who specifically reached out. So we've got at least 3 community boards that want to talk about last mile trucking facilities and what's happening, but that we pull together representative community boards. The letter basically first goes through identifying the issues, the challenge about what they call out in California, they call these diesel death zones, these trucking facilities. So that's language that's there about how they're being supercharged. The letter then outlines specifically to Community Board 7 a little bit more about what we're seeing or anticipating on 19th Street. And then we talk a little bit about the fact that we've hosted these 3 meetings from first in May, then in July, then in October, and this meeting in November, and a little bit of what we heard in those meetings. But very simply, it's outlining the key issues. It's outlining the fact that the community board is convening these discussions, and the call to action to these elected. So this is, again, sorry, it's not the full letter here, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what's there. We also heard a couple of other specific possible interventions tonight, like special permit zone or the special permitting like we had with them ones with hotels. We've heard a little bit more about the indirect source rule that Chief of Staff from Marcella's office, Jenny, talked about, BQE, lighting, kind of like interventions. But I want to invite you as committee members, please go into this document. If you don't have access, we'll deal with it after, provide comments. And if you can take through the weekend to give us time just to go through it so we can present it to the December board. Are there any initial reactions or questions to that next step from anybody on the community board? You all are experienced with these types of things, but John DeLuper, yep.
All right. So I'm reading this. I'm really interested, and I've gone to some of the meetings, but not all of them. But I'm curious: does that mean that this letter is kind of like the end of this special committee, or was there going to be more like a report or something? Because especially hearing all these possible solutions and some of the updates today really makes me think that maybe something even more than a letter might be helpful in continuing to raise this issue going forward. Now, I understand that that means a lot more work creating a report versus a letter, and that's a more extensive process. But I figured to mention that and see what everyone here thought, whether that's something worthwhile or not at this point.
Yeah, not the end. I think what we've done right now is just identify it, and we heard some of the problems and the challenges, right, that we've heard from the community and organizations, and still need a lot more work to do to get out there. But Community Board 7 has not been on the record about these like last mile facilities. We have to be on the record about the challenges that we're facing that are going to be compounded by this. So this letter is about being on the record. And now it's not just being on the record of Community Board 7. We have 6 and 5 and others might come about. There's a big story that's supposed to run later this week on last mile trucking facilities. And so I think kind of getting this as a citywide issue. So I hope that's a response. The response is like, this is just the start, and this letter is just to get on the record to have catalyze this next step, which is a call for meetings at the highest level, and really this should be paid attention to by the mayor's office early in the new year.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions from any of the committee members. So thanks everyone for your engagement. Richard, you've stayed on to the bitter end. Thank you again as a presenter and a speaker to join us for so long. Again, we will just be sort of in virtual communication, but an actual meeting of this committee wouldn't be until early in the new year. So just letting everybody know about that, and see you all soon. Thank you. I adjourn the meeting. It's over. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Katie.